Well, I'm now joined by the Scottish Labour leader, Richard Leonard. Richard Leonard, thank you for joining me this afternoon. Just first of all, you've been listening to the briefing. Just what's your reaction to what the First Minister has been saying today?
Well, I think I say in tone of disappointment rather than anger. Once again, we are seeing a situation where the Scottish Government has failed to anticipate, failed to plan, failed to put in place the testing infrastructure, and frankly failed to act on the scientific advice. And I noticed that the First Minister's choice of language was to talk about grounds for people being able to go home. But if you actually read the Scottish Government guidance that was published last night, the language is of a much more confrontational type. It talks about, well, let me read it. It says it is a defence to show that there was a reasonable excuse in the circumstances to return home. So he's talking about defence and excuses and so on, really putting the blame back onto those individual students. And I just think that sets completely the wrong tone.
But do you not accept that we're facing such a difficult situation just now? And the key thing is that they are determined, the Scottish Government is determined not to allow households to be mixing because that spreads the virus.
Yeah, Andrew, I get that. But just yesterday on the BBC, Professor Mark Woolhouse from Edinburgh University was telling us all that this was entirely predictable and that there had been modelling to show what would happen when you got a mass influx of students, especially those going into halls of residence where there is communal living. So the concern that we've got is once again, we are seeing the repeat of mistakes that have been made earlier. So the failure to anticipate, plan and test was a problem at the earlier part of this pandemic in care homes. In August, it became a problem with the return of schools. And now it's become a big problem with the return of students to universities. And we are really concerned that the steps that have been taken, even with the modifications announced last night, really do challenge and potentially violate the human rights of those students who've been singularly selected for special treatment. And we just don't think that scapegoating of students is at all acceptable.
But if you'd been First Minister and perhaps you had seen some of that advice, what would you have done differently? Because it's so important to get the universities and colleges back, not just for the economy, but for young people's learning and their welfare and well-being.
Yes, Andrew, but part of leadership is listening. And as you heard from Matt Crilly earlier on, the National Union of Students, the University and College Union, other trade unions that organise the workers who deliver those educational services in higher and further education were both warning that a return en bloc to face-to-face learning was not sustainable and that there would be these kind of problems. So there ought to have been an understanding of that and a much more cautious approach to the mass return and arrival of students.
So I'll just repeat in a way, what would you have done differently? Would you have had students going back in a staged way or maybe not going back to December? What would have been your different policy?
Well, the different policy would have been an understanding that there needs to be more distance learning, and that, as Matt Crilly from the NUS said earlier on in the programme, that a default position of distance learning would have been a better starting point than seeing people coming en masse into communal forms of living in student accommodation. And the other thing is, once again, I repeat, a failure to anticipate, a failure to act on the scientific advice, a failure to understand the predictability of the crisis that we are now facing. And it really isn't good enough for the same mistake to be repeated over and over again. There should have been an understanding that this was an entirely foreseeable circumstance and action should have been taken to prevent it. And the action would have included more distance learning. Right. The action would have included an understanding that some subjects certainly can benefit from distance learning, whereas others necessitate students being present in laboratories and so on.
Richard Leonard, the Scottish Labour leader, thank you very much for joining us this lunchtime.
Thanks, Andrew.
Well, David Wallace-Lockhart joins me for the final time on the programme. And David, we've been hearing this from the opposition parties and indeed the Scottish Conservatives here in Scotland, that actually the Scottish Government should have been better prepared. But it is a very difficult situation when there was that keenness to get the universities and colleges back for the economy, for students' well-being.
Absolutely. There's a number of factors at play there, and it's interesting to hear both Richard Leonard, the leader of Scottish Labour, and Matt Crilly from NUS Scotland talk about, perhaps with some benefit of hindsight now, how there should have been more focused on remote learning, distance learning for certain subjects. I think everyone's of the opinion that there are subjects, specific sciences, perhaps medicine, engineering, where face-to-face contact and going into labs is very important. But for some subjects, students perhaps wouldn't have got the full experience in their first year, but could have done learning from home, from more remote bases. In fact, a lot of them are learning remotely, even from the student halls. So perhaps that's something the opposition will be bringing up in Holyrood this week. Also interesting there to see Richard Leonard bring up the human rights aspect there for students. That has been something that some people and some lawyers have been raising, that students perhaps face sanctions, face punishments that other people who weren't in student accommodations wouldn't have really been facing for, and therefore their human rights were somehow infringed. I suspect the new guidance we have seen come out in the last 24 hours will go some way to addressing those concerns, because of course students now told that if they are struggling, there is that route home.
Well, David Wallace-Lockhart, thank you for your contributions to the programme throughout the course of the afternoon. And that's it for now. Of course, just an update on the number of cases. 222 new cases, although the First Minister was pointing out there could be a bit of a weekend impact there. 6.9% of those tested positive. More news and analysis on Reporting Scotland at 1:30. But from all of us in the programme, thanks for being with us. Bye-bye.